Good afternoon. I think it's afternoon. Yes, it is afternoon. Good. Okay. This week we're discussing Parshat Lecha, also Lechi, Lach, for those of you that know the Debbie Friedman Zechron Shalom song. And I'm calling this Sarah Takes the Leap 2. Avram has given the direct order, and his wife Sarai, as they are now known in the beginning of our narrative, goes along for the ride. Or is that really what's happening? In perek Yud-Bet, we read about God's instructions to Avram about taking leave of all that he knew. And then this, Vayikach Avram et Sarai ishto ve'et Lot ben Achiv et kol rechusham asher rakashu ve'et nephew asher asu beCharan ve'yatzu lelechet arza Canaan ve'yavo arza Canaan. Avram takes his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all their possessions that they had acquired, as well as all of the people, kol nephesh, the singular, asher asu beCharan, that they made in Charan. They set out heading towards Canaan, and they enter Canaan. As we have discussed, we have a mixed use of singular and plural forms as a meaningful part of the message of the text. So we must notice the transition here. Vayikach Avram, singularly, took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his cousin, his nephew, and all of their property that they had, et nefesh asher asu, and the folks, the souls that they made, we've now gone to plural, in Charan v'yatzu, and they went out, alechet arza, to go to the land of Canaan, v'yavo, to the land of Canaan. We begin with the singular and we move to the plural. We understand that we are now looking at both Sarai and Avram as being active in doing something significant with the souls, the people who are with them. According to Aviva Zornberg, we make two observations at this point. One, both Avram and Sarai are soul makers, the use of the word nefesh. Zornberg reinforces the midrashic understanding of Bereshit chapter 12, verse 5, which states that Avram and Sarai made souls in Haran. The verb made, asu, is very unusual here, and Rashi explains that it means that they brought people to their way of life, leaving the idols, starting this new venture. We now call it anachronistically Judaism, but starting to bring them along the way to what we know as belief in one God, the faith element of Judaism and everything that we believe. Avram converts or brings this to the men. Sarai brings it to the women. Zornberg uses this to show this switch between singular and plural, because she attends to language, that Sarai is not in any way a passive partner who was taken, Vayikach Avram et Sarai, and Avram took, but rather she becomes very quickly a co-creator and spiritual guide alongside Avram, who was able to take her own initiative. Nechama Leibowitz agrees with this approach and understanding of the Midrash, as found in Bereshit Rabbah, chapter 39, verse 14, and 39, verse 21. Next, the internal journey. Zornberg looks at the command, Lech, Lecha, go forth for yourself, and we've talked about that in previous years, as a call for both Avram and Sarai, thus Lech Lecha Lechi Lach, to undergo a profound internal spiritual journey, moving beyond their familiar selves to become their true aspirational core selves, both individually and as an intentional and complete partnership. This is in spite of the clearly male-gendered language of the text. We learn here, in looking at what is behind and underneath the actual words, as Zornberg often challenges us to do, that the contextual inclusion of Sarai in this mission is critical and necessary for the mission to make sense. The text hardly moves forward when Avram and Sarai are confronted by a serious challenge to their partnership. They approach Mitzrayim. Ka'asher higriv lavo leMitzrayim, Avram says to his wife, Vayomer el Sarai ishto, Hinena yadati ki isha yafat ma'arat, you are a beautiful woman. The Egyptians will see you, and they will say, Ishtozot, this is his wife. They will kill me, and you they will allow to live. please say, Imrina achotiat, that you are my sister, so that it should go well with me for your sake, because of you. And through you, my life will be spared. Now, some look at this as Avram is saving his own skin and sacrificing Sarai. On another hand, we could say that they become complicit in this, that they go along with it together, that they share the plan. There are many situations where it looks like one party, and we will see this a lot in stories of women, is being compromised. For example, when Yaakov works for Rachel and then ends up being tricked by Laban to have Leah with him first. And there's a lot that we will discuss much more in that week when we come to it, that Leah is given certain cues, certain actions, certain characteristics of Rachel, like she talks to Leah, so that Rachel becomes part of the ruse instead of the victim of the ruse. So Abram comes to Egypt. Back to our story. The Egyptians see Sarai as beautiful. The ministers see her, speak highly of her. Pharaoh treats Adam very well because of her. And here he acquires great flocks, cattle, donkeys, bondmen, bondwomen, she-donkeys, and camels. And we'll hear about his riches later. At this point, Hashem et Paro negaim gedolim. God inflicts great wounds, great harm on Pharaoh and his household because of what he did in terms of Sarai. Pharaoh then summons Avram and says to him, why did you not tell me this was your wife? What have you done to me? Zornberg points out that while this text is reported through Avram's perspective, and often we will see that and we will entertain and figure out what is the female perspective through various hints in the text, midrashim and other means, we must ask ourselves, what is Sarai feeling at this point? Is she feeling fear, vulnerability, or courage and confidence with the knowledge and faith that her life partner would not put her in harm's way, but rather create this ruse so that they will both be okay? Further, I would ask, does she perhaps understand on some level by participating in the ruse that they will both benefit and triumph? Sorry, asthma, rain, and this weather don't go together very well. As for Leibowitz, Nechama, she challenges us to address the moral implications of Avram and Sarai's descent into Egypt due to famine, and Avram's decision to present Sarai as his sister. By analyzing these different commentators and others, she explores how some explain their decisions as understandable under duress, while others see it as demonstrating a lack of faith. This dynamic will repeat often throughout our Torah narrative. We only have the language of the actions. We don't necessarily have the language of the motivations. How do we fill in? What do we figure out? What is going on? What is working from the language? What is going too far? What is in our imagination? This will repeat many times. An additional thought. Is it possible that both Avram and Sarai, acting in tandem, are forging ahead together through the duress and relying on faith? Devorah Steinmetz, another contemporary voice who often amplifies those voices, who may demand more attention, focuses on the complexity of the Avrahamic journey. Steinmetz frames the entire narrative of Lech Lecha as a journey full of the messiness of human existence, including deception, jealousy, infertility, and so many other dynamics. In this context, Sarai is not a flawless figure, but a central character grappling with these imperfections right alongside her husband. Here they are very much needing and depending upon each other, both serving the role articulated earlier in our text as truly being an ezer kenegdo, helpers to each other, both in holding each other up and picking the other one up as needed. But the plot thickens. Now, Sarai Eshet Avraham lo yalda lo vela shivcha mitri ushma Hagar. We know this from the end of the previous Parsha, in Parshat Noach, at the end, when it brings us to this point with Sarai and Avram, where it says, Hi aita akara, she was barren and did not have children and would not have children. So at this point, Sarai, Avram's wife, had not borne him a child. She had this Egyptian woman, her helpmate, her servant, named Hagar. And names are very interesting here as well. Avram, the father of many, of whatever, will become Avraham, many. Sarai, princess, the element of hey is introduced into both of their names, from Avram to Avraham and Sarai to Sarah. And Hagar already has the hey there. And ger, we know, means stranger, lives, abides, convert, all of those different things. These are the names we're dealing with. So Sarai says to Avraham, look, God has not given me children. Hinei na atzarni Hashem miledet. God has stopped me from giving birth. Please go to my bondwoman, to my servant, and perhaps through the merit of her, I will bear children of my own and be built up. Avram listens to Sarai and does it. Avram's wife Sarai convinces Hagar, V'tikach Sarai eshet Abraham et Hagar mitzri shivcha miketz asa shanim l'shevet Avram ba'eretz Canaan v'titen ota la'Avram isha lo l'isha. Convinces Hagar the Egyptian, after Avram had lived in Canaan for 10 years, to be given to her husband Avram as a wife, as a second wife, if you will. Vayavo el Hagar, he comes to Hagar, she gets pregnant, and she sees that she conceives immediately. Now, V'tareki harata v'takel givrata be'eneha. She sees that she is conceived, and she is part of the household, and now Sarai is lowered in her esteem, in her vision. Sarai now says to Avram, you are to blame, Hamasi, for my wrong. It's on you. I've given you my shivcha, my servant, and now she sees that she's pregnant and she regards me with disdain. Yishpot Hashem beini uvenecha. God will judge between me and you. Avram says to Sarai, here, do what you want. Deal with her as you see fit. So Sarai deals with her horribly. But Tanes Sarai, that where Anna is going to come in later in other Parshiot, about debasing somebody, putting them down, causing them to suffer. Vativrach mipanecha. Hagar fled away. An angel of God finds her by a spring of water and says, Hagar, where are you coming from? Where are you headed? And she replies, Mipnei Sarai givarti ani barachat. I am fleeing from my Sarai, my mistress. Here we do not see Sarai in a favorable light. On one hand, she understands Avram's role given what God has promised him. However, while she does what she feels she needs to do to enable her husband, her partner, to do what he needs to do, she is not immune to feelings of envy and fear that evolve from her acquiescence to the role that Avram must fulfill, prompting her to give him Hagar to have a child. In her analysis of Bereshit, Parakim, chapters 16 and 21, Nechama Leibowitz explores the tense relationship between Sarai and to become Sarah and her maidservant Hagar. She analyzes the narrative not as a straightforward tell of good versus evil, which she does not do generally. She always wants us to look at the nuance, to see what's wrong with the good person, if you will, and that people, as we learn in Gemara, ein davar ke tzaddik gamor or rasha gamor. There's no such thing as a complete tzaddik or a complete rasha. We need to see our humanness containing both things that are good and perhaps things that are more challenging. She rather would look, this is back to Leibowitz, as at the situation as a psychologically and ethically complex human drama with profound moral takeaways. similar to the methodology of Aviva Zornberg, who gets much more into the analysis of the situation. So let's look at the mistreatment in chapter 16 of Bereshit. In the first of what will be two incidents of forced exile for Hagar, and there's an irony here. 2 times Avram and Sarai will come up to a paro, to a leader, and he will repeat that thing, she is my sister, so that compromises Sarah. And here 2 times Sarah is going to compromise Hagar. The reason given for this action is that Hagar despised Sarai. It was kind of like, look, I have a child and you don't, after becoming pregnant. And this prompted Sarai to deal harshly with her, leading to Hagar fleeing and showing us that Sarai is a human being who has feelings. Leibowitz explains that Sarah's action was a flawed human reaction to a painful situation, a lesson that people are not expected to endure superhuman feats of indefinitely living with a second wife in the household. She highlights the human feelings involved and emphasizes that the Torah records this incident to teach about the ethical complexities of such family situations. Additionally, I am certain that there are important lessons here about decision-making and considering the full range of potential consequences when we do make such determinations, no matter how measured. To that end, Leibowitz's teachings on Sarah illustrate her overall pedagogical approach to the Torah, which emphasized deriving religious and ethical messages from the biblical narratives and the characters within them. Further, she believed that the true message of the text was not in the trivial historical or archaeological details, but in the moral lessons that could be applied to here and now. By analyzing the commentaries of classical sages like Chazal, like Rashi and Ramban, Leibowitz prompts students to grapple with the ethical dimensions of the biblical text, which we may not find much voice given to within the Torah itself, but we can extrapolate. In the case of Sarah, this involves wrestling with a matriarch's flaws and difficult decisions while also approaching her role in shaping Jewish destiny. Aviva Zornberg analyzes the story of Sarah and Hagar by using psychoanalytical means and literary criticism, and drawing upon midrashic traditions to explore the complex inner lives, desires, and traumas of both women. Instead of viewing them as simple and isolated and singular antagonists, she interprets their conflict as a profound and painful entanglement rooted in the themes of infertility, motherhood, and displacement. Sarah's perspective in terms of the inadequacy and the grim realism of her situation is interpreted by Zornberg not as simple cruelty, but as stemming from deep psychological and emotional pain. The trauma of infertility was a source of great shame and inadequacy for women in biblical times. You were defined by your children, if you will, and we're going to see that play out for sure. When Sarah offers Hagar to Avraham to bear a child, her desperation is clear in the statement, perhaps ulai abana bahar, ba. Perhaps I will be built up through her. After Hagar conceives, she looks with contempt upon Sarai. Zornberg, following the midrashic tradition, suggests that Hagar's change in attitude triggers Sarah's fear of replacement and deepens her sense of humiliation. For Sarah, Hagar's pregnancy is painful, as well as a public reminder of her own barrenness, which we learned about before our Parshat even began. Her cruelty is a reaction to this profound injury to self more than hatred of the other, according to Zornberg. Further, we are left to wonder what exactly was in Hagar's look from her perspective and that of Sarai. Remember Cain and Hevel? They go out to the field, one person says something, and poof, we've got fratricide. These details are often missing in the text and provide great space for midrashim and for commentators to come in and imagine what was in reality going on, because we want to know. We're not just looking at the dry details. We're looking at how did we get from action A to B to C. Further, Zornberg highlights a midrashic interpretation of chapter 12, verse 17 of Bereshit, where Sarah finds her voice in a moment of utter degradation. As Avram and her are caught in a most uncomfortable position, it goes, when they were confronted by Pharaoh. For Avram, Pharaoh dealt well, ba'avura, for the sake of Sarah, and the Lord plagued Pharaoh. He was smitten with the disease for which marital relations are harmful, and his house was smitten as well. Al davar Sarai, al pi Deborah, and this is through the commentaries, all because of Sarai, her word, her orders. She said to the angel that accompanied her, according to Midrash Tanchuma, smite, and he smote, behu makah. So in other words, according to the commentaries, the result that came to Paro was al davar Sarai, that she spoke. This is what Zornberg calls the faith of grim realism, where Sarah, who has no direct connection with God other than through her husband, following him, as we said, at this juncture articulates the fragility of her reality directly to God, thus initiating this relationship and changing the course of events. This establishes her as a complex figure who asserts herself through her own initiative without being prompted by her husband. In addressing Hagar's perspective, Zornberg also illuminates the inner world of Hagar as she does for Sarah, focusing on her own unique encounter with God and her vulnerability. When Hagar flees Sarah's cruelty, she is met by an angel of the Lord in the wilderness. Zornberg emphasizes that Hagar, who's an outcast and a refugee, is the only person in Bereshit that has God speak to her outside of the promised land. God's acknowledgement of her distress in her displacement confirms that all lives are precious to God, regardless of status, regardless of place. Further, Hagar names the well she finds Be'er Lechi, the well of the well of the living one, Lechi Roi, who sees me. Zornberg also notes that this is the first time in the Torah that a human being gives a name to God, Chai Roi, signifying a direct, intimate, and deeply personal relationship. This, of course, will be returned later when Hagar's son is named Yishmael. God hears him. And it's interesting to juxtapose that name with Yitzchak, which is reflective of the laughter that his parents had when hearing that he was going to be born. And naming is also very significant. Hagar's ability to be seen and to see God highlights her spiritual significance, even as she remains socially marginalized in our narrative. Regarding the nature of the conflict between these two women, Zornberg discerns a portrait of psychological and generational trauma on both of their parts, rather than that parable of good versus evil. This is, I believe, the most important aspect of her scholarly work, to see and address the many complexities within the narrative instead of boiling them down to simplistic and inaccurate dichotomies. There's no happily ever after here. This is not going to be a story of reconciliation, but rather a scarred forever story of misgivings. The pain of this entanglement between Sarah, Abraham, Hagar, and their sons, Yitzhak and Ishmael, will resonate both in their generation and in generations to come throughout the rest of Bereshit. We live in a broken world, and so do our predecessors. Zornberg ultimately suggests that the Sarah and Hagar narrative exposes a world as dangerous and unreliable as Sarah came to experience it, both with the pharaohs and then between these women and ultimately between their sons and as we move through the story of our ancestors. Unresolved conflict, the pain of motherhood, banishment of Hagar and Ishmael all demonstrate the tragic consequences of human desperation and the fragile nature of family relationships in the biblical world that gets repeated generation after generation. Here is the reality of our narrative and where the real salient lessons lie. We do not live as perfect one-sided beings in a perfect world, but rather we all go forth. Lech, Lecha, Lechi, Lach. We take huge leaps for our own sakes, and we leap into the messiness called life. Shabbat Shalom.